Tonight's face-to-face is going to address the question about whether or not nuclear energy is a right policy choice for Slovakia. And I'm very pleased that we have a special guest here tonight from the United States, Mr. Scott Peterson. Thank you, Scott, for joining us. The embassy is very pleased to sponsor this discussion because our country, the United States, has long been one of the world leaders in nuclear power generation. In fact, we produce more nuclear power more electricity through nuclear power than any other country in the world. We have over 100 nuclear power plants in 31 of our 50 U.S. states, and we produce, let me get the numbers here, more than 800 billion kilowatt hours of electricity, which is about 19% of U.S. electrical power generation. So we've long been a leader in this industry. We just recently went through a period of about 30 years where there was little nuclear power plant construction in the United States, but that has recently changed, and the estimations are that 4 to 6 new nuclear power plants will be brought online by the year 2020. 2 years ago, the Fukushima disaster prompted a renewed discussion of nuclear power, particularly focusing appropriately on the safety of nuclear power. And so I'm pleased that we can have this panel discussion tonight to explore the current status of nuclear power and the question of safety, both here in Europe and in the United States. So thank you for joining us, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Let me welcome all of you at today's discussion. We will talk about nuclear power plants and whether nuclear energy is the right path for Slovakia. It is organized by the U.S. Embassy together with Open Society Foundation, and it is a part of face-to-face discussions. The discussion will be simultaneously interpreted to English and to Slovak. So if any of you needs interpretation, please take your headphones. Let me introduce our guests. I will start with a lady, Mrs. LUKÁČOVÁ from Energy Analytics, Head of Analysis. She deals with the various areas of energy and gas. She works with business models. Before joining Energy Analytics, she worked with price formation in energy generating company, so she has wide experience. Let me welcome Scott Peterson. And we've had a chance to meet him in the morning during the workshop. Several of you were present there. It was a workshop organized by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Peterson is a Senior Vice President of Nuclear Energy Institute, and he's responsible for external relationships. He's a professional advocate of nuclear energy in the United States. And today he will share his experience from US mainly. And last but not least, we have Dalibor STRÁSKY here. He has a very interesting history. He studied nuclear energy in Prague at university. He worked in a Dukovany nuclear plant, and he also worked as an operator in a nuclear power plant. And since 1990, he works as a consultant in the field of nuclear energy to NGOs. He also worked for the public government, and he cooperates with the Upper Austria in terms of nuclear energy, and he's a constructive critic of nuclear energy. That's how he calls himself. My name is Michaela Benedigová. I am a vice president of American Chamber of Commerce. I also work for public relation agency Seesame, and I've worked in the area of energy for several years, so I have two hats on my head, and I will try to lead or coordinate discussion today. And we have 5 topics that we've agreed upon to discuss today. First, we will talk about trends and the structure of energy mix around the world to start up with. Then we'll deal with economic aspects of energy market and environmental aspects of nuclear energy. Then we will deal with topics which will be more emotional, I guess, and that is a topic of safety of nuclear energy. And we will also talk about public discussion on nuclear energy, because anytime we start to talk about this topic, people get very emotional, even though it might be a very technical debate mostly. So there are many people here who have experienced public discussions, and it might be interesting for them. Right from the start, I'd like to ask our panelists whether there are any advocates of nuclear energy here. Would anyone identify themselves as critics of nuclear energy? Yes, one lady. I am not an advocate, I'm not a critic. I would call myself a specialist, a technician who has devoted her life to analysis of the dangers and hazards. I specialize in hazardous situations, and I've been present at several discussions where we discussed construction of new blocks. I have not presented myself in front of a lay public, but I thought for myself that it's about the time that I present my views publicly. So, you are a professional in the area of nuclear energy, as I understood? Okay, so we have at least 2 specialists here, definitely, and the others here probably are lay public. Okay, thank you for identifying yourselves, and now I would like to ask our panelists to answer the first round of questions. So, Mrs. LUKÁČOVÁ, what do you think about the structure of energy mix around the world? Could you compare this between Europe, Asia, and North America when it comes to energy mix? And why is the development as it is at the moment?
Ďakujem za slovo.
Thank you. First and foremost, I'd like to start with Slovakia and its energy mix. In Slovakia, nuclear energy has a very stable position when it comes to installed performance. It's 24%, but when it comes to consumption, it's 53% of total consumed electrical energy in Slovakia. Well, we look at it from a very simple perspective. If we wanted to replace this energy source, then we are just not able to do so. That means that there's high probability, there are high odds that nuclear energy is going to keep its position. Slovakia is not an exemption to the rule. In Europe, one of the extreme country is France, where 75% of its energy comes from nuclear power. And we look at the whole world, and we have Asia, for instance, where Japan, and we definitely will talk about Fukushima and the disaster there. The share was about 30%. That means pretty high share of nuclear energy, because Japan has no natural resources and it needs to import them, and thus nuclear energy was a reliable source for electricity production. In other countries, such as China, India, there is quite a development of nuclear energy.
Some of the smaller, older reactors were shut down because they were no longer economic. But over the past 15 years, we've been able to increase the efficiency at U.S. reactors, actually bringing in many of the lessons learned from the operations of our European colleagues, so that we've improved the efficiency of U.S. reactors, which was once only at about 65% on average, to now 90%. So we've been able, in that time, to basically add the equivalent of 26 new reactors without laying a single piece of brick or mortar, just by increasing efficiency. But we're at the point now where we've enhanced efficiency to the maximum that we can at the existing reactors that we have today. So we're at the point where we're now building. We're also relicensing and extending the utilization of our current reactors, which were originally licensed for 40 years. And so beginning 12 years ago, we started going through the license optimization process that our federal regulator has laid out for us. And so each one of the U.S. reactors has an opportunity to go through that process and to earn another 20 years of operation. And so far, 73 of our 104 reactors have done that, and we expect virtually all of them to complete that process. So we've been able to really get as much electricity out of the existing nuclear power plants that we have today. So we're now building 5 reactors, and we're about a third of the way through construction on the new AP1000 designs, which is an enhanced, safer design than the plants we have operating today. And that will take us probably to the year 2020, when we will look anew at what the electricity demand is in the United States, because electricity demand has retreated back to about 2007 levels with the recession. So what we see in the U.S. right now is, outside of nuclear energy, is a significant fuel switch from coal to natural gas, because of the discovery of massive amounts of shale gas in the United States and the difficulty of environmentally permitting coal plants with new Environmental Protection Agency restrictions on coal. So coal once provided half of the U.S. electricity and is now at about 34%. And gas in recent years was 17% of the electricity production, and now is almost 30. So you can see the fuel switching that's starting to happen in the U.S. sector. Renewables are growing in the United States due to incentives, both federal and state-based incentives that are spawning a pretty healthy renewables industry, particularly for wind. So wind and solar and other renewables, except for hydro, are at about 6%, and hydro is a couple of percentage points higher. So we believe in the U.S. we have a very good diversified electricity mix. That's clearly part of our energy policy, is to take advantage of all of the natural resources that we have. And as we transition into an era where we are meeting Clean Air Act standards in the United States, and our President and Congress is now starting to look at potential carbon restrictions, we are moving very rapidly to a lower carbon footprint. And because of that, nuclear energy will continue to play an important role in our diversified mix.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne. Pán Stráský, chcete aj k tejto téme niečo možno...
Well, maybe from the country of where you work now in Austria. What's the situation like? What's how it has been unfolding when you compare it with Czech Republic, Slovakia? How do you see the energy mix and development in EU? As you have mentioned the topic, we have heard facts. When it comes to Austria, Austria has the advantage that there are many rivers. So when we look at electricity, we see that 70% of electricity comes from hydro, and the rest is covered by coal plants and the renewables and the gas plants, of course. And we cannot hide the fact that Austria also imports part of its electricity. And the trend is sort of towards the long-term or permanently sustainable sources. So the renewables are very strengthened along with stronger or weaker decentralization of the system and sort of pushing away the fossil fuels, and the priority is to get rid of import of the energy, because Austrians quite frequently say, or on another hand, it is said there are many critics outside of Austria who say, okay, you criticize nuclear energy, but you import nuclear energy, so you should really beware of what you are talking. So the policymakers are trying to push away the import and the nuclear power outside of their portfolio. So let's go back to the second topic, and I'd like to really push it through. Those are economic aspects of nuclear energy. We have about 2 years and a couple of days after the Fukushima disaster, where there was decision of Germany to leave nuclear energy until 2020 and to stop producing and to close down all their power plants. How do you see the economic efficiency of the nuclear power when it comes to the price? Because price is the thing that really matters when it comes to competition of economic zones. And when we look at the divisions of EU, and we all adhere to European values, but at the same time we have those commitments when it comes to the cuts on emissions from coal production. So how do we see it when we compare it with the US, who stand outside of Kyoto Protocol? Do you believe that European the nuclear power production can actually lower the electricity prices or will it have a negative impact on the prices of electricity? So what's your economic perspective, Mr. PETERSON?
Well, in the United States, nuclear energy is one of the most efficient production modes of producing electricity. It's averaging about 2 cents per kilowatt hour just from a production sense. And so that's traditionally been lower than coal and natural gas. Natural gas now is now setting the market price in the United States because of the significant availability of natural gas and the fact that it is low cost. So the markets are changing in the United States, and both in the pricing and the structure. So half of our states have regulated markets where the cost of electricity is set by a state public utility commission, and about the other half of our states have competitive markets where the prices are set daily on the market. In those states, natural gas is setting the price for electricity, and so we have to compete with that low-priced natural gas. What we're starting to see, however, with the price of gas is it's starting to rise. So as long as gas is about $4 per million BTU in the United States. Consistently, nuclear can compete with that. And we believe that the price will continue to increase as exports of natural gas increase from the United States, and natural gas is used in manufacturing, and as the manufacturing and chemical industry rebounds in the United States, there'll be more draw on that gas. So we and many other analysts see an upward trend in gas pricing, which will maintain the competitiveness of the existing reactors that we have today in the marketplace. And that's very, very important for us to maintain the diversity of fuel supply that we have in the electricity grid. Now, when you look at building new nuclear power plants, the issue, of course, with nuclear is it's very capital cost intensive to build these plants. So very expensive on the front end for construction. But the value proposition for nuclear is once you have that cost embedded, it's a very low electricity price for 60 years or more. But you have to have the markets in place, and you obviously have to have the financing in place to build the plant in the first time and then amortize the cost of that plant going forward in the marketplace. So we are looking in the United States at new financing models. There has been federal loan guarantees for the construction of nuclear power plants passed as part of law in the United States, and the Department of Energy has awarded provisionally one of those loan guarantees to two of those reactors that are being built in Georgia, but that program hasn't been completed yet, so the loan guarantee actually is not being used. There's a screening process that takes place to be able to access that loan guarantee, where the Department of Energy will look at the project, have an independent evaluation of that project done, and then decide whether it will actually award the loan guarantee, and that process has yet to be completed. The other new nuclear plant project that we're building in the United States has gone to the financial markets now 5 times for capital for that project. In each case, there have been more investors than needed to fund that project. So that's a very good sign for the economic stability of that plant and the willingness of the financial markets in the U.S. to finance nuclear power projects. So the key thing going forward in our nation is to make sure that we're adding electricity capacity that is both low cost for consumers and for businesses to keep families competitive in their budgets, to keep our businesses competitive, but also looks at the cost of environmental protection. And we think that's a significant cost advantage, again, for nuclear energy, because we don't produce greenhouse gases in the process of producing electricity at nuclear power plants. And I know we're going to talk about environmental factors a little bit later, so I'll address that again. But when we look at some of the data we see from the Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration on the levelized cost of various electricity options that could come online in the year 2018. So our Energy Department has looked at what the potential cost for all of the fuel sources might be, and nuclear energy is about in the middle of the pack. When you look at natural gas, advanced coal with carbon sequestration, which is the only way we believe that really coal will be built in the future once and if that technology is proven. And then, of course, renewables are very, very attractive on price in that formula as well. So that's why we'll continue to go forward in the United States with a portfolio approach that balances all the options, both in terms of fuel supply and price, so that we ensure that we have a very competitive energy market, both for consumers and for our businesses.
Thank you.
Ďakujem pekne. Now, what do you think about the economic value of nuclear energy from the other side? I believe that when answering these questions, we have to differentiate between energy generated by existing reactors built in the past and between the energy and price for energy that should be produced by the plant resources. We know that it is very costly to build new reactors. And when we look at Europe or Czech Republic or Great Britain, we can see that without some form of public incentives or state incentives, it is not possible to build reactors. If we stick to Czech example, you may know that Czech Republic is planning to build 2 new reactors in Temelín and 1 in Dukovany. And it was found out that these new reactors would produce 1 megawatt hour of electricity for 70 to 90 euros. If you look at the prices of electricity on European market, you can see that it's about the half of the price of the current prices of electricity. You can see that if investors compare these figures and some forecasts for the future, they probably will not go for this option, or they will seek some incentives. In Czech Republic as well as in Great Britain, the model of support, which is widely discussed, is a model where it would work similarly to renewable energies incentives. So the state would guarantee that investor would get some lump sum as long as the energy is sold for a certain price. If it is sold for a higher price, then the investor would have to give back to the state budget what was additional price. There are estimates that in the least favorable case, the state budget would have to pay about 5 billion Czech crowns. And there are also other estimates which go up to 17 billion Czech crowns. This is a sum that will have to be paid back by consumers. And if it is politically correct or not, that's another discussion. You can see that the tendency around the world is to prolong the duration or the life of existing reactors. You have heard the figure from US, and that is a proof of the fact that the old reactors produce electricity on very favorable terms and conditions, so there is a tendency to prolong their life. There is also a question of the risks, dangers, which are always involved. When it comes to the prices, we also have to talk about uranium. You have heard about operational costs. They are very low, mainly due to the fact that uranium prices are now very favorable or advantageous. If you look at forecasts of the sources of uranium around the world, the forecasts aren't very optimistic. They talk about 50 to 70 years, depending on how the sector of nuclear energy will develop. And the smaller the reserves of uranium, the higher the price for them would be. And there was one deviation from the smooth development of price for uranium. I can't remember quite well when that was. At that point, Czech Republic started to think about renewing the mining for uranium.
So if you allow me, I'll give floor to Zuzana, who is here to talk about numbers. What has the German step to go away from the nuclear energy done with the prices? And you as an analyst, what the international sources say? What kind of impact will this have on the overall and long-term price of electricity? Because the short-term sort of like extreme was not all that bad, but what are the various scenarios for development of nuclear energy in Europe and the price of this energy? Well, at the time when the Fukushima disaster happened, the electricity prices just went up, rocketed up, and then the prices went down gradually. And the second price shock was when Germany decided to close down or to stop nuclear power plants. But then it was a surprise, the prices were going down, and currently the prices are at a very convenient level, which from my perspective is a bit of surprise, because if we take Germany, that started to replace nuclear energy to great extent by renewables, that is considered to be very expensive due to investments into technology, and probably it compensates it with coal. And yes, indeed. And then we have this more expensive source, which is coal. The expectations or forecasts were that the prices would rise, but still the price is pretty optimistic. Well, what's your explanation then? I would say that after the first shock, there was this soothing of situation. The situation was managed. Of course, there were problems, but renewables are not stable. There can be blackouts. There can be. This is really not ideal for the grid, and then it needs to be compensated by coal. But Mr. PETERSON said or mentioned in his morning lecture that thanks to this, the US went more for shale gas, and then we got cheaper coal that was imported into Europe. This was probably one of the factors that balanced out this price situation. But then other countries did not make such extreme and radical steps like Germany. That means Slovakia, Germany remained stick to its old scheme, primarily Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe extends nuclear power as a stable resource, positive for a grid with a good long-term predictions. But when we look from the consumer's perspective, that means what's the potential impact on the companies and their competitiveness? The difference is that the price for the companies is governed by the prices at stock exchanges. And of course, the prices at stock exchanges don't need to reflect the fact that we have a big share of relatively cheap nuclear power or nuclear energy, but this is all governed by supply and demand. So this was definitely one of the factors that balanced out the price. And still we have a crisis going on where the demand for energy is maybe a bit lower than usual, which has also an impact on the price and on the price going down. This would be a sum up why the price did not or has not rocketed up. So when the new resources are going to be launched, we know that Poland is considering something, and some other countries of CE are planning to use other resources. Could this have a long-term impact on the energy price in our region? Well, I think that at the stock exchange, the price consists of demand and supply, and in fact, produce my electricity cheaper, then I actually earn money because this is the situation. But of course, I can run a different risk, that I can't produce such a cheap energy as the stock exchange is showing or is indicating the price, but this could be balanced out by demand and the supply. But this could be compensated by, for instance, expanding nuclear energy. The producers could actually earn money if the stock exchange price would be higher. So this is a long way, really, for the consumer to feel all those differences and influences. Yes, definitely, this is a long way, and I don't think there should be any extremes in prices. I believe the price is really going smoothly, and its development is really sort of smooth without any extreme values, of course, provided that there are no more disasters like Fukushima. And we can see it on the graphs. There are only very mild extremes in the process. Okay, let's go to the next topic. Impact of nuclear energy on environment. So what are pros and cons from the environmental perspective of the nuclear energy? Whether we talk about the emissions of CO2 or other environmental aspects. So how do you see environmental pros and cons of nuclear energy?
Well, the environmental aspects that are associated with nuclear energy are fast becoming one of the most important benefits of using nuclear energy, not only in the U.S. but globally. And certainly in the United States, we actually started into the nuclear power business back in the 1950s because of air quality issues. And we were using a lot of coal. And using coal in areas where we also had a lot of steel business, and so the air was very dirty. So we actually got into the nuclear power business at the start to make sure that we were improving our air quality. And so here we are, some 60 years later, really looking at the same situation globally on how can we use nuclear power coupled with renewables and hydro and other emission-free sources to establish an energy system that's going to not only protect our air quality, but also reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that are being emitted into the atmosphere. So we've really come full circle on the application of nuclear energy as an environmental protection tool. So in the United States, even though nuclear energy is only 20% of the production, it's almost 2/3 of the carbon-free electricity production that we have. When you compare that to hydro and renewables, far and away the most significant climate change tool that we have, not only in the U.S. but in many other countries as well. So nuclear energy, because of its clean air benefits, will be important. When you look at the entire life cycle of electricity sources, which many policymakers are doing now, not just do you emit greenhouse gases in the production of electricity, but take a look at each energy source from the mining of that fuel to the construction of the plant, to the operation of the plant and production of electricity, and then the process of decommissioning that plant. What is your full footprint of carbon emissions throughout the entire operation of the plant? And even when you look at nuclear energy through that lens, it's a very attractive environmental tool. So only two energy sources, wind and geothermal, have a better carbon footprint in the entire life cycle of those facilities than nuclear. And nuclear is a fraction of the carbon footprint of natural gas and coal. So no matter what lens you look at nuclear power through when it comes to carbon emissions, it has to continue to be a major tool in how we both ensure clean air today and prevent warming of the planet in the future. One of the other important environmental aspects is the licensing process that we have for nuclear energy facilities in the United States. So the first thing we must do before we build a nuclear plant is look at the environmental alternatives to producing new electricity. And so we've got a law in the United States called the National Environmental Policy Act that requires us that if we want to build a new power plant, we have to look at what will be environmentally attractive as the options, not just cost, but for the environment. So every time we build a new facility, we have to go through the steps that law requires us. And then we have to go through an environmental permitting process through our Nuclear Regulatory Commission that requires us to prove to the regulator that there will be no environmental damage as a result of building the facility at the particular site that we want to build it. So even before we get into the construction process, we've gone through 2 environmental assessments that have public participation built into them. And in the new process of building nuclear power plants in the United States, that public participation is actually moved up to the front of the process, where it used to be at the end. So the environmental aspects of not only siting but building and then taking advantage of nuclear power over the 60 to 80 years it's going to operate have been vetted all the way through the process of building the plant and operating it. And we include the public in every step of that process as we go forward, not only in permitting and construction, but when we go to renew the license to optimize that facility for an additional period of time, the public is also part of the process that is engaged in that as well. So for the United States and for many countries around the world that are together building 71 nuclear power plants today, nuclear power is not only an important and cost-effective energy source, it's also a significant clean air compliance tool. And that's why you see China building 26 reactors today in an effort not only to provide electricity, but to help with the tremendous air quality problems that they have in that country.
Pri debate o environmentálnych aspektoch zrejme nemôžeme vynechať.
When talking about the environmental aspects, we definitely cannot omit the issue of used fuel rods and fuel from nuclear power plants. So how do you see this specific part of environmental impact? What to do with burned or used fuel from nuclear power plants, fuel rods? Because there are many question marks whether there is any final solution to it, where to store it, or whether we need to wait for more results of science and research and how to actually use this fuel as such.
Well, when we look at how we manage used fuel from reactors today in the United States and really globally, we have to account for all of that fuel and actually store it at the nuclear power plant sites in the United States. And we have 2 methods of doing that. We keep it in water-filled concrete and steel vaults that are part of the plant. And in the United States, we have the issue where those are filling up. So when that happens, we take the oldest fuel rods out and put them into steel and concrete containers filled with inert gas to keep them safe, and then move them onto a storage pad that's essentially a concrete slab that these containers stand on. From an environmental perspective, we have to account for every single spent fuel element that we store in our reactors. So we know what our byproduct is. It's a solid form. Each fuel piece in a reactor is a solid pellet about the size of the last digit of my small finger, so it's a solid material. We account for each and every piece of fuel that we use in our reactors, and we keep it safe in one of those 2 storage methods. In the United States, the federal government, by law, has accountability for final disposal of that fuel. And it's scientific consensus globally that the best way to manage that for the long term is in a disposal facility, typically underground in a mined-engineered repository. And so many countries around the world, including the United States right now, are exploring locations for those repositories. Some of the countries in the Scandinavian area are really the countries that are well ahead of us in that process. We have a good candidate site in the United States that the NRC was reviewing a license application for. We spent a lot of time investigating that site, but that process has been suspended as we look at whether there's a better way to look at siting a long-term disposal facility. But in the end, that's what the U.S. law is, and that's how we'll proceed with disposal. I think a key component of that is because this fuel still has about 90% of the energy content left in it, even when you take it out of the reactor, we want that fuel to be retrievable so that if 100, 200, or 300 years from now there's a way that we can actually recover the energy out of that fuel and recycle it, we want to be able to go back in and get it out. This will not be an easy process so that anybody can go in and move the fuel, because these will be in huge containers that can only be moved by electric train in our model. But it's important, we think, that we preserve the energy so that if future generations determine a way to actually maximize that energy, we can pull it back out. But our commitment today is to manage, that this generation manage that fuel, because we were the benefactors of the energy from that fuel. So we'll continue down that path in the United States, responsibly managing the byproduct that we have that's at our sites today, and then ultimately moving that to a federal government repository that will be built by the Department of Energy in the United States.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne. Asi teda pozitívny.
I believe there is definitely positive influence of nuclear energy production on environmental aspects, especially when compared with the carbon footprint. But there is a certain risk involved that is undoubted. So let's start with risks, and then we will go over to safety aspects as the last part of our debate. Okay, so I will leave the risks for the next round. And now I will start with the risk assessment on environment. And if we look at the operation of nuclear power plant itself, of course, we will it is hardly disputable that there is a lot of harmful effect produced, but nuclear energy, of course, is also causing certain level of harm. It can be calculated, we can compute it, there are different analyses for it. When we compare nuclear energy to coal energy, of course the emission of carbon with nuclear power plants is much lower. When we talk about mining for uranium, it can also be compared, and we can calculate it. So it depends on the system of calculation. Of course, we're not talking about radioactive emissions here. Maybe you have encountered, or maybe you have seen some comparisons between these two types of energy production. Those emissions which are produced by carbon are not produced by nuclear, so it is diverse. There are various scientific analyses which are trying to find some common criteria for all these contaminants, but scholars are not able to agree upon one uniform methodology for comparing these effects. So we can only say this is producing this and this type of emissions, and the other one is producing the other types of emissions. But there is all we can say at the moment. What do you think are the important harmful effects of nuclear energy, in your opinion? So, in my opinion, the disadvantage of nuclear energy is, of course, the nuclear catastrophe. There is a very low risk of that, but very harmful effects.
I'll give you my personal perspective. I grew up relatively close to a nuclear power plant. I grew up in Piešťany, and when I was considering what actually shaped my perspective and my opinion on nuclear power plant, it's the fact that the parents of my friends used to work in a power plant, and as of my 12 years, actually, I knew pretty well how the nuclear power plant worked, and without my ability to actually consider its safety or non-safety, I got used to this technology. And then through education or sort of awareness raising or some safety measures, we actually used to meet or we were confronted with the safety instructions and safety issues. And I believe that the debate on safety should be understood in two levels. One is technical level, when we talk about technical possibilities and technical risks, and the second is emotional level, where we actually create certain positions, certain perspective on it, and many times we are not able to give arguments for why do we believe in this or that. When you look at the debates on the safety of nuclear energy, what do you see as the biggest problems? What are the biggest problems you see? Well, I believe that the debate is really challenging. The debate on nuclear safety is technically very, very difficult, and not all people are interested in all those technical details. So when you look at the debates on nuclear energy, many discuss money, because people understand money. Then people discuss policies, etc. But when it comes to safety, the safety is sort of left up to the experts or people who have authority or who are considered to be professionals and experts. One way or another, I believe that we could debate about such a very difficult topic as safety is. Mostly, you have heard, most probably, that the risk is calculated by the probability in which there may be a very dangerous or big disaster. And then there is a debate. What are the impacts? The people give numbers, and many people cannot imagine what the numbers actually mean. Then the probabilities and the odds of things, what could go wrong, are debated. Of course, not a single power plant is 100% safe. There is always some potential risk, and then we go back to the policy, whether the residual risk is acceptable for the society. What should be the criterion for accepting the risk? What do you think? What I'm saying, if the society is going to accept it, of course, depending on the statistics and various calculations, you could actually calculate how big should the probability be, due to the fact that we have this and that number of reactors running on in the world, and then there is a graph that exists from which you can calculate that each and every single reactor or plant, there should be the probability or the odds 10 to minus 8 probability of a potential accident. And if the risk, the potential risk is 10 to minus 5, then the situation is different, but 10 to minus 7, this is quite a safe and good situation. So the probability is very important. And again, those are numbers, certain certain consequences. The real question is whether the society is or is not open to taking such a risk. Let's take Germany. German society considered this risk to be unacceptable, full stop. And if you look at the Eastern Germany, and if you look to Slovakia, the society really, in Slovakia, for instance, society is okay with actually even higher risk, potential risk of an accident. But if you look to Germany, this was really a strong political decision, like in Italy a longer time ago. So it looks like that in old European states, nuclear energy is much more political topic, and it's a very sensitive topic, much more than in eastern part of Europe. Yes, of course, and politicians in those older European countries and decent countries, politicians do what the society wants. So if the society wants something, the politicians go with it. But let's go back to the safety issues. Mr. Peterson, you said that in the morning when we were talking that in the US you have more than 2/3, and that the people in the US, according to the surveys, public opinion surveys that you presented in the morning, the people are pretty okay. They feel that the nuclear energy is pretty safe. So explain, please, why this is so. And then I would like to go back to one more topic, sort of a principle change in what do we think about nuclear energy after Fukushima disaster accident, and then what kind of measures were taken after Fukushima?
Well, some of the data that I presented this morning was looking at public opinion survey data in the United States that our organization conducts with an independent researcher. And we ask several questions about every 6 months over the course of the last 30 years. So we have a very strong trend on many, many questions on public opinion on nuclear energy. One of those questions that we typically ask is the member of the public to rate the safety of U.S. reactors on the scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is low safety and 7 is high safety. The survey right before the events in Japan, 69% of Americans gave U.S. reactors a high safety grade, so 5, 6, or 7 on that scale. When we did the survey again in February of this year, the number was exactly the same. And a lot of people are surprised by that. But one of the commitments that the industry has, in addition to the top commitment being to operate our plants safely, is to communicate to our stakeholders, communicate to our customers, and to our policy leaders about the steps that we were taking on safety after Fukushima. Because we knew that there would be questions, many, many questions about the safety of nuclear power in general, and what the U.S. industry's response to the events in Japan was going to be. And so one of the industry's top priorities was to not only take the steps to analyze the events in Japan, and we had experts in Japan within a few days of the accident, not only helping the Japanese technically try to solve the issues, providing them materials, as many other countries were doing with nuclear programs, but also really to look at a minute-by-minute timeline of what happened at Fukushima in the first 4 days, how, as an industry, we could have responded differently, and what technically, and from a safety system perspective, what were the challenges that those plants were going through because of the loss of power. So we cataloged that in great detail, brought it back to the United States, provided it to our regulator, so we were both working from the same set of facts on what happened there. And so in the 2 years since then, we have been looking at particularly those aspects of plant safety that would be needed to prevent the same kind of occurrence if we had significant natural challenges to our plants. So very, very strong earthquakes. We don't have the tectonic plates around North America that would produce those kind of earthquakes, but nonetheless we can have very strong earthquakes. So we're using new seismic data to go back and look at how to make sure our existing plants can be safe against an even stronger earthquake than has ever been occurred in the era of each nuclear power plant in our country. We're doing the same thing with flooding because we don't have tsunamis, but what would happen to our sites if we had a major dam failure on a river that created another dam failure, that created another dam failure, that created another dam failure? A highly, highly unlikely scenario, but we want to make sure that we can maintain safety at our sites against those kind of scenarios. So we've developed a program that provides additional safety equipment at our sites, staged at various locations, and really the issue is twofold. How can we maintain power to critical safety systems that will then get water to cool the reactor, which was the problem they had in Japan. They lost power and the ability to cool their reactors. So we're adding a sixth layer of backup power at our sites and additional pumps that will be able to get water into systems regardless of where the problem is on the plant. You can move that portable equipment around it. A significant time and resources over the last 2 years to have that dialogue and have that discussion so that the people in America would feel confident that we were still protecting them against the most significant natural events that could occur, but not only today, but in the future.
Tomu verejnému dialogu sa ešte dostaneme.
When it comes, I'd like to stop by when talking about the tests after Fukushima, the sort of burden test. You started testing the sort of resistance. How can the plants resist a certain burden, be it or certain unexpected events such as natural disasters? So how those stress tests were implemented in the US and how they were implemented here in Slovakia or in Europe? Mr. STRÁSKY, you spoke a lot about those stress tests. Could you wrap up very briefly? How do you see it, please?
The role of these tests is to find out what are the safety issues or reserves, the room for improvement in individual reactors, and if these stress tests prove that there is some insufficiency, we will find out what the steps need to be taken in order to increase the safety in case of such improbable event as happened in Fukushima. I've monitored the situation in Czech Republic and Slovakia, as well as in Slovenia. And really, all those operators in these countries found some room for improvement, so they've adopted action plans. They took some measures which will take place in different times and deadlines. When you look at the reports on how they found out that there is a room for improvement, you will see that first of all they said that they've assessed only the ideal accident when only one reactor was harmed and everything else is working as it should properly work. So if there is an earthquake, for instance, which will exceed all expected scenarios, then of course not only one system will be disturbed, naturally more systems will be disturbed. What I would appreciate in Slovak power plants is that they honestly accepted that it is not possible, it is not in the capacity of the teams to assess a combination of different failures. This was a very useful action initiated by the European supervisory bodies. And this action actually produced the first comparative study in Europe, and For me, a communication between specialists and experts is not very good. It's very feeble. There is no real exchange of information and data. We only talk about methodology and formulas and types of calculations, but nobody tells you concrete figures or results. Nobody will tell you what their findings are, what is their situation in their reactors. So, what you are trying to say? So, the stress tests were done in order to find out what are the safety reserves. And for me, it was firstly important to find out that there is no unanimous understanding of nuclear safety in Europe. It means there are huge differences between countries, and this is what I've encountered through all my career. Individual countries have different safety limits, and they widely differ from each other. Countries use completely different parameters for their calculations. Technical details are very diverse. So there is complete disharmony in practices used. This was discussed several times in the past, and it cost us lots of money. Nonetheless, we still have no unanimous understanding of nuclear safety around the globe. And the second important finding for me was that station blackout for all the blocks, meaning large blocks, like 1,000 megawatts and more. I don't know precisely, but basically for large blocks, if station blackout lasts for 4 hours, and for smaller ones it's 10 hours. So the safety reserve, if we have no electricity supply, is almost zero, and the fuel will melt down. So the safety reserves were there. Even in Fukushima there were some reserve or backup supplies, etc. But because of the natural conditions, they failed, they didn't work. And one of the conditions in the stress tests was that on condition that 72 hours it is not possible to have any heavy technology brought in. Heavy technology means one huge diesel generator which you need to bring via some large road. And to my knowledge, even in countries like Switzerland or other advanced or developed countries, there is a problem with ways of transporting such large technology to the nuclear power plant. Let's not go into technical details. So, all in all, the stress tests proved that there is vast room for improvement. So there should be better equipment right in the nuclear plant, and even in case where there is no way of transporting any huge technology there still should be on site some reserve, some backup technology. As far as I know, there are action plans which were published. I'm not a specialist. But we have also producers here, or someone from the side of manufacturers. When it comes to diesel generators, we have 6 of them. So each of the diesel generators can provide energy to the nuclear power plant for the critical systems, for cooling systems, for each of them. Plus, we know what happens if the first one falls down, if the second, third, etc. Of course, if more of them fail, we need to bring more diesel generators. There is always a space for bringing more generators and for seeking safety reserves. In the nuclear business, there is always room for improvement. We keep increasing the level of safety, and this is a never-ending process. It is just a cycle of finding out where is the room for further improvement. And among operators of nuclear power plants, there is constant dialogue taking place because, first of all, we want our nuclear power plants to be as safe as possible. And on the other hand, there are also national supervisory bodies who keep telling us what to do and what level we need to increase the safety to in order for the safety not to be a subject of any compromise. So in case of stress tests, always if you simulate a scenario, you will always find out further ways of improving the current situation. I understand, maybe we should say here that after publishing an action plan, what did Slovak companies do? What was the process behind?
We adopted a national action plan that is going to be implemented. Many measures have started or had been implemented already before Fukushima, or the system for managing very severe accidents that is recommended in various countries within stress tests. So we have had it implemented. Actually, we're in the final stages when it comes to seismologic resistance. We started with that plan, and it's implementing far before Fukushima and many others. And when it comes to earthquakes, really our nuclear power plants are the one with the highest level of safety in this area. Mr. STRÁSKY and then Mr. PETERSON. I once actually should have said it at the very beginning. I would like to actually advocate for the operators, because actually something much more was demanded from the nuclear power plants that they were actually designed for. The safety networks and the safety systems of the nuclear power plants were designed in such a way that they managed the maximum project accident, and that was an accident on the main circulation pipeline, and all the other issues were considered to be beyond the accidents the predictable accidents and not predictable accidents, but those that should be managed. So when you look at the severe accidents in various nuclear power plants, never ever actually such an accident has happened. Never ever the main circulation pipeline broke, but many other things occurred that were not predicted. So now the safety regulators and all the regulators are trying to really squeeze those power plants to maximum. Very briefly, please, when talking about stress tests, we got the task, okay, look at your nuclear power plants and find the gaps, the safety gaps. It's not that somebody came and told us you should do A, B, C, D, but the operators look at their own nuclear power plants and looked how. So you perceive it as auto-regulation, self-regulation? No, of course there was a national regulator, like regulatory body, but nobody had such a capacity and knowledge as we have. Of course, we know the power plants the best. Mr. PETERSON now?
Yes, I just wanted to address two things in the conversation. One of them is the availability of backup diesel generators. Sorry about that. So I wanted to address two issues as part of the conversation. One is the installment and availability of locomotive-sized diesel generators at our plants, which my colleague here mentioned. So every U.S. plant has not one of those per reactor, but two of those per reactor, so that if you need backup power, if you lose power from the grid, the way that they did in Japan, you have redundancy even in those large backup generators, so that if for some reason one of them fails, and you test them routinely to make sure they don't, if one of them fails, you have a backup to come into place. After that, you have the battery bank that our expert spoke about. Now, we did learn from Fukushima that we must be able to provide a longer period with battery banks. So one of the lessons learned is how to extend the battery life if for some reason your off-site power is gone and your two diesel generators fail. So how do you extend the battery life beyond 4 hours? So the industry is looking at different ways to do that, the possibility of fuel cells to actually charge those batteries, so you extend the life of those. The other thing I want to mention is what my colleague here said in terms of operator actions. And there is very specific training in the industry for reactor operators, whether you've been operating for 5 years or 25 years, that in the U.S., our reactor operators go through a week of training and retraining every 5th week on the job. So they go to a simulator that's an exact replica of the control room they work in, and they do nothing but train on accident scenarios. Every 5th week, their entire career, training on accident scenarios, so that virtually anything that they will see over their careers, they've seen it multiple times before in the simulators. And another key difference between the U.S. industry and Japan is the operators in that control room have the authority, based on guidelines that they have to prevent severe accidents, to take the steps necessary to do that. They don't have to call a supervisor. They don't have to call the government. They have the absolute authority to take those steps they've been trained to take. And they have guidelines that they will pull out based on the scenario that helped walk them through that process. So it's a very intentional training, a very intentional set of guidelines that's available to make sure that those severe events, no matter what the cause, are going to be managed well.
Jednoznačne by to malo dosah na to, čo by sa ďalej dialo s jadrovou energetikou na Slovensku. Gabriel Bianche, I'm a social psychologist. One way or another, I ended up in a group of people. I'm a marginal member of a group of people that should participate in making the dialogue between public and professionals in nuclear energy more transparent. And that's why I was present in the morning session, and I am here now because I want to sort of get into this topic. I want to be more empathetic. And when I listen to you, one thing becomes crystal clear to me. And what's actually shocking to me is that one thing is a skeleton in the cupboard, and I see it as a principal problem in our culture, and culture is very important, and we know that values can split and divide people all around the world. And this skeleton in the cupboard is the following: why the communication with the public, at least in Slovakia or in our environment, is not working, and why the reaction of the public, if there is any, is always extreme, very emotional, very strong and powerful. It's difficult really to establish a rational, deliberate dialogue between public and the experts, and the cause is clear. All of you experts keep on saying how grand is the safety of the nuclear power plants, 6 times, 10 to -8, whatever. The numbers are really impressive, that they are really, really safe. If it was all this wonderful and great. If it was not a really very important issue, then all those safety measures would not be needed. If the safety issue was not so important, then there would be no two backup generators at every single power plant. But what Mr. Strásky was saying in the morning, it's this nuclear power plant risk is completely different. The accident in the nuclear power plant is completely different to the risk then I walk out of my house and it may not rain. But if a fuel starts to melt in the nuclear power plant, and let's take Chernobyl or any other accident in the nuclear power plant, it is disastrous. It is enormous. There could be such a gigantic catastrophe. None of you have said, and not a single expert in the world would ever say that an accident cannot happen. Yes, you say that, yes, an accident can happen. And it can have enormous impact on a high number of people, maybe worldwide, for a long period of time. And nobody says anything about this. You keep on silent. This is a complete taboo. If it was put on the table that all of us sitting here at the table, all of us advocates of nuclear lobby, of nuclear energy, we are aware that we play a game where, even though the risk is minimal or the odds are very, very low, there is still a chance that there could be a huge nuclear accident. And if until you say that bluntly, you will not have confidence of the public, because this is hide and seek game. This is my kind of feedback to you.
You brought me to the topic of public dialogue, which we wanted to discuss as a last point. If I understood you right, you were saying that we were not talking about the real risks. I would just like to add one sentence. I've listened to your vocabulary. You are using your language very intentionally. You were talking about the license for a complete nuclear power plant. You were talking about optimization of license. Previously, you were talking very clearly, and then at the end you said optimization. That is a work with language. I am not reproaching anybody, but this was a very intentional use of the language. You are a specialist, you must have your lifelong experience. You were talking about seeking room for improvement. To me, that is imperfection, that is insufficiencies. But you were talking about room for improvement. So let's go to the basis. How could we conduct public dialogue in such a way that we reach better understanding between lay public and experts, so that at the end of the day, when there is a referendum, as we've seen in several countries, that would be there would be a real dialogue. So how should we discuss those legitimate worries that people might have, and how should we respond to these worries in order to reach balance between pragmatic arguments and the work with accepting the level of risk? Mr. Peterson?
The issue you raise is a very important one, and it's a true one. In the industry in the United States, we have many public meetings with our regulator and with the industry and with members of the public. And in 50 years of doing this, we haven't figured out how to have the right conversations at the right level with the public. Now, part of the issue is language and terminology, and we've seen it here tonight. And I sort of smiled inside when I heard the first 10 to the minus 8, because we know what 10 to the minus 8. It took me a while to learn what 10 to the minus 8 was, because I'm not an engineer, but nobody in the public really knows what to do with 10 to the minus 8, or what context to put it in. And so, you know, I believe, and some of our companies in the U.S. are getting to this point where they're demonstrating this belief that the only way you can have this conversation is to have it regularly and in small groups, so that over time everybody comes to the middle on language, comes to some understanding at just a basic level about some of the concepts that we're talking about, because they are highly technical, and they're highly technical in a number of different ways. And it's almost virtually impossible for a member of the public to go to a public meeting on a nuclear energy topic with the industry and the regulators in the room and understand what's being said, unless the moderators and the parties from both sides have some very specialized training on how to have that conversation. And so that typically does not happen. So what some of our companies in the United States are doing, particularly those that are now building new reactors, are forming local community advisory committees, and I talked about this a little bit this morning, where they're inviting, say, 10 members of the community to represent that community and have a monthly meeting with members of the nuclear plant company. And they can ask for certain experts to come to those meetings if they have questions about radiation protection, or how did we manage used fuel, is this facility really safe? They can ask for people to come specifically address those issues, and in an hour and a half get that information and then take it back into their communities. And I believe that's the best way at a very local level to have the conversation, where you're having it over time in small groups, where you can actually have an interface with one another in an environment that's not highly charged. Because again, in many meetings they become highly charged, whether it's because of the debate between industry and NGOs, or even some debate between industry and regulators. So that's the optimal way, I believe, to communicate on our issues. It's also a very difficult and time-consuming way. But I think if we want to have success, that's the kind of model that we have to pursue. The other issue that's a problem for us in the United States, that when we teach energy in the schools, it's a curriculum that is not, I would say, an expanded curriculum. And what we found, at least for nuclear energy purposes in that curriculum, it's in the back of the textbook. So sometimes the students never even get to it. So we have had energy education centers at many of our nuclear power plants. We're recommitting to those so that at least we can bring students in to those centers and familiarize them not just with nuclear energy, but the broader energy landscape. And so why renewables are important, why we can't just take all of the coal out of our electricity system in a matter of 5 years, why that may take time. And really talk to them about the full value of all energy sources, and why that a good mix of those sources is important, and how you juggle all the factors that we've talked about today: safety, cost, environmental factors, because they all have a role in how we produce the optimal electricity system that's going to be protective of the environment, protective of public safety, yet one that we can still afford to have. So the only solution that I can recommend is that we do it at a very small group level, almost like we're doing here tonight, but this would be the first of many conversations that we would be having on this issue, and not just one that we did and then we all walked away from it.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne.
Two sentences, and I'll hand it over to you. Today I had the opportunity to work in a team where we had the task to facilitate the communication between the stakeholders, be it investors or in energy sector, and many times this is the situation with developers, I guess. And it's a tendency in our culture that people just mind their own business and they don't care about the things that are relevant for the whole of society or community. That's the first thing, and I consider to be of extreme importance to keep and to establish a regular contact and to establish a very open debate and really not playing this hide-and-seek type of game you were talking about, because if we are hiding something and we are just trying to go with sort of like very general answers to specific questions about safety, this is then the road to hell, because people care about their safety and we need to talk to them about their safety and things that matter to them on a regular basis. I would just like to follow up on what has been said. In December 2012, the General Directorate for Energetics for Energy Sector published a report, BIPNA, Public Involvement and Participation in Nuclear Activities report. So this is it. It's about involving the public into dialogue, into decision-making on nuclear energy. And this plan is very precise. The public should become one of the parties, apart from the regulator, operator, and the operators of the grid. The public should become the fourth pillar of the safety. And of course, each country should take care of this business on the national level, and then they should go to the community level, where on community level there would be regular meetings of experts, stakeholders and the public. A very typical example could be stress tests, when after publishing of the test results there should be a group summoned, and then the comments should be taken also from the public and for the experts. There are two role models, France and Great Britain, in this initiative. Well, this is not a coincidence. France and Great Britain have the highest level of acceptance of nuclear energy as a part of the life and a part of the energy mix by the public. So in those communities, in those environments where the public understand what's the nuclear energy about, what are its risks, what are its benefits, those are the places where the nuclear energy is more accepted. Thank you very much. And we have 3 to 4 minutes because we are running extra 30 minutes to our debate. But please, I would like to ask you for last 2 sentences or questions, and then we should close our debate. I have an invitation for you. Come. We have many initiatives. We do debate with our community on active basis, and those who went through our debates, they have learned a lot about nuclear energy. Support of nuclear energy is or let's say it in other way, the closer the people are to the nuclear power plant, the more family members are working for a nuclear power plant, the higher the acceptance. This is the rule in our country and in our environment. So please, come and see. I'm Michal Hudec, and for those of you who don't know me, I have been involved in this topic a lot, and this is a very passionate issue for me. I don't have an exact analysis on how to communicate with the public, and I have a couple of observations, and sorry if I make it into 20 sentences. One thing that has happened in Slovakia is that when a new alert system was installed at the nuclear power plant in Jaslovské Bohunice, before it was handed over to the power plant, the alarm went off. It was by mistake, and a great portion of population in the environment was really scared. Then the citizens got involved in the debate. Then that time Prime Minister Radičová, who said how it is possible that how they dare this nuclear power plant, how they dare to make such a big mistake and to sort of to let it happen that this alarm system went off. But the real problem is why those people got scared, why the amount of fear was so high. The people did not actually understand. They didn't have any knowledge how to protect themselves, what to do, what does it mean, etc. So the public is indifferent. I will jump in. The public is maybe negligent, or the public doesn't care because maybe it has no access to this type of information on safety. You grew up in Piešťany, close to Jaslovské Bohunice, and I grew up close to another nuclear power plant, and we from our elementary went to see when it is we wanted to see the nuclear power plant. We wanted to be there when it started working, and so at those times there were certain awareness-raising campaigns. They were talking with us at that time. I do not have any evidence to support my statements, but I do say here that the public is just not interested in this issue. We are sitting in this room and we have the electricity on and the light is on, and can you imagine that we would be sitting here in the dark and having no mics to talk? We take it just as a money-back guarantee, and maybe we should have that type of educational blackout, that we actually realize that this is not something we should take absolutely for granted. We should really care, and we should think about where we take our energy from. And the price is high, really. I'd like to wrap it up here, saying that the biggest debate was on civic participation on the issue of nuclear power, or nuclear energy, and maybe in Slovakia it's not only about nuclear energy, but it's about our ability to be involved as citizens. This is our setback. This is our challenge. The civic participation in Slovakia is on low level. We don't have culture in that, and I would like to encourage all of us here that we should be both hands, we should be provoking the public to talk about this issue. We should try to really work on the dialogue, make it better, and we should really provide sufficient information to the public so that it can make informed judgments or positions. Sorry, I can't hear the speaker because he's not talking into the microphone. What is the risk that I've heard actually that hackers could attack nuclear power plants? Very, very briefly, Mr. Peterson. So what's how high are the odds that hackers would attack information systems of nuclear power plants? And then we should really wrap it up and finish.
First and foremost, nuclear power plants in the United States are not connected to the internet. So most of the threats that you hear about from cybersecurity that are internet-based simply can't happen at nuclear energy plants because we're not connected to the internet. The real issue for us in terms of cyber protection is when you have vendors or others in the community that are coming into your plants, and I was looking for my thumb drive, that bring portable devices with information on them. And so the challenge that we have, and we had to meet some federal regulatory guidelines on this by last December, is how to keep the people who might want to create damage to your systems, number one, the physical security that keeps them out of your plant to begin with, and then how do you make sure that you're monitoring that information that comes in on portable disks or thumb drives or keys, I think you call them here, to make sure that you're not getting malware or any kind of virus into the plant. We are developing encryption software that will be able to scan any of those portable drives before they go into our systems. So number one, physically keeping those people who shouldn't be in the plant out, and I think certainly after 2001 in the United States, there's a very slim chance that anybody will get into our plant that doesn't belong there because of the upgrades we've made in physical security. So then the real issue then is not an internet-based attack, but how to prevent any kind of malware or virus that could be brought in on those key drives. And we have a very rigorous program in place to prevent that already.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne.
Thank you very much for your response. One more microphone, please. I've come here because I was really attracted by the title of this debate, whether Slovakia is ready for, I'm not sure about the real title, whether nuclear energy is the right path for Slovakia, but we sort of did not touch upon this issue. I expected completely different type of debate because we were not talking at all about the risks. You said at the beginning, somehow we did not touch upon that, and neither did we touch the issue whether Slovakia is ready for nuclear energy. I can see that your frustration, but we are not experts in nuclear energy, and the intention of this debate was not to really lead it on a professional level. There are other forums for that. But the very question you asked in the title of this debate, whether Slovakia is ready for nuclear energy path, we would definitely need to have different speakers. We made a decision, we structured this debate in the way we did, and I hope that some of you at least got response to their questions. It was very interesting to me, that part talking about civic participation. I'd like to thank Mr. Scott Peterson and Zuzana LUKÁČOVÁ and Mr. Dalibor STRÁSKY from Upper Austria for your participation in today's debate. I would like to thank all of you for your inputs and your comments. Have a nice evening, and I very much hope to see you at the next debates of Face to Face program.